Before we drift into tonight's story, whether you're here to rest, to unwind, or simply letting this play softly as you fall asleep, I'm really glad you're here. Tell me in the comments, what's one place in the world you'd love to see in person one day? If you find peace in calm history like this, a like or a subscribe helps this series reach more gentle minds who love Rome's story as much as you do. And quietly, almost everyone who listens, about 99%, hasn't subscribed yet. If that's you, maybe take a moment to join us. It helps more than you'd imagine. Now, settle in, let your shoulders relax, breathe slowly, and let's begin our journey. Dawn rose over the Bay of Naples like a breath drawn in sleep. The first light touched the edge of the sea and ran inland, over rippling water, through rows of vines, until it struck the tiled roofs of Pompeii and turned them softly to gold. The city was small by Roman standards, but it felt complete, a miniature reflection of the empire's order, pressed between mountain and sea like a jewel set in stone. To the east, Vesuvius stood serene and pale, its slopes wrapped in morning haze, its crown dusted with green where olives and vines had taken root. The mountain's stillness was ancient, older than Rome herself. Farmers had plowed its sides for generations, finding its soil rich beyond measure, never wondering what price the fertility demanded. In the narrow streets, the world began to stir. A baker's apprentice opened the shutters of his shop. Cool air spilled in, heavy with the scent of yeast and grain. He knelt beside the oven and coaxed the embers awake, feeding them with dried twigs until they glowed the color of sunrise. Outside, his mother swept the threshold clean. She paused to greet a neighbor leading a mule loaded with amphorae, each marked with a painted fish to show the garum within. They spoke of the weather, of the ships expected from Alexandria, of nothing that mattered and everything that did. Farther down the lane, a small girl released a caged bird. It fluttered to the fountain, drank, and vanished into the light. The girl laughed. Her father called her in for breakfast. It was an ordinary sound, and that ordinariness is what haunts us now. At the Forum, marble caught the rising sun. The market columns stood in long perspective, their shadows stretching like sundials toward the temple of Jupiter. Vendors arranged baskets of figs, olives, and dates. Metalworkers opened their stalls, and the first ring of hammer on bronze sang through the air. Above them fluttered the red banner of the magistrate's office. It moved gently, as if waving to the centuries that would one day come to look upon these stones. A senator visiting from Neapolis paused on the steps, admiring the harmony of line and space. He murmured that Rome was a god of geometry, where proportion itself was a kind of worship. His companion laughed softly and agreed. They moved on, leaving the words behind like a prayer. Beyond the walls, the countryside was already alive. Farmhands guided oxen through the furrows. Their plows turned black soil that smelled faintly of smoke and salt. The dew steamed from grape leaves as the sun climbed higher. From the road to Stabiae came a string of carts, merchants bringing oil, pottery, and stories from the wider world. Pompeii was never isolated. Its streets echoed the pulse of Rome herself. By the harbor, fishermen hauled nets heavy with silver scales. Their shouts mingled with the slap of waves against the piers. One of them looked toward the mountain, squinting into the brightness. A puff of mist, or perhaps a thin trail of smoke, rose briefly from its summit and disappeared again into the blue. He said nothing. The others were already laughing about the catch. In the Villa of the Mysteries, a painter stood before a wall he had been preparing for days. The plaster was still damp. The red pigment shimmered like wet clay. He lifted his brush, and the first curve of a goddess began to appear. Venus emerging from the sea, her gaze turned toward eternity. He thought of his wife and newborn son in the next room and smiled. Art, he believed, was how mortals could borrow a little immortality. Toward midday, the light grew strong and deliberate. Shadows retreated to the feet of the colonnades. The city's hum deepened into the rhythm of work. The scrape of sandals, the clatter of pottery, the calls of traders echoing down the long stone corridors of air. Somewhere near the amphitheater, a group of children played with a wax tablet, drawing a crude chariot and cheering as though it raced. A teacher passed by and corrected their Latin endings. The children groaned. The teacher smiled. Even language was an inheritance here. The empire's voice carried into every syllable. By early afternoon, Heat shimmered above the paving stones. Citizens drifted toward the shade of porticos, and the fountains became meeting places of gossip and laughter. Someone mentioned a faint tremor felt the previous night. Someone else dismissed it. "The earth sighs," he said, "as we do." They laughed and returned to their wine, and overhead, unseen, a slow pulse began to move within the mountain, so deep, so vast, that no ear in Pompeii could hear it. The day continued, golden and sure of itself. From a distance, the city looked eternal. Terracotta roofs, white marble, green gardens, a small civilization complete within its walls. The sea glimmered like a mirror to the sky. To live here was to believe in forever. And that, perhaps, is why the gods love silence before they speak. Midday gathered itself like a bright coin and set upon the city. Pompeii breathed in the heat and slowed to its measured pace, not idle, not hurried, simply Roman, work arrayed in order, speech in clear lines, 1,000 small intentions pointing toward evening. In the forum the stones shone white. The porticos held pools of shade where buyers and sellers drifted, hands describing prices, shoulders tilted toward agreement. A scribe at a folding table sharpened his stylus with a small knife, and the curls of wax he shaved away clung to his fingertips like petals. He wrote receipts, names, quantities, the empire's quiet arithmetic, kept in tidy columns. Near the temple of Jupiter, a magistrate listened to two neighbors quarrel over a shared wall that had shifted a finger's breadth in last week's rain. He heard each man in turn, nodded, and traced a plan in dust with his staff. A line here, a payment there, a boundary restored without resentment. Justice here was not thunder but habit, the practiced calm of a city that believes tomorrow will resemble today. The baths kept their own weather. Inside, steam made a mild fog of the caldarium. Knees and shoulders faded softly into it as if into memory. Water struck marble with a quiet, endless rhythm. Men leaned against warm walls and talked of grain from Sicily, of a horse from Capua, of a rumor that a poet from Rome might read at the theater next month. Someone mentioned a tremble underfoot while shaving that morning. Someone else waved a hand. "The mountain shifts in its sleep," he said, closing his eyes. The others hummed agreement and returned to the comfort of the water. In the frigidarium, a boy held his breath, counted the thin stars of light trembling on the surface, and plunged. He rose laughing. His laughter ran like a small stream through the tiled room. A father remembered himself at that age and smiled without moving. On the Via dell'Abbondanza, the day wrote itself in detail. A mule's bell chimed. A fig burst underfoot. A woman balanced a basket of apricots, steady as a temple column, and paused to buy a length of dyed wool for her sister's wedding. At the fuller's workshop, men worked the cloth with their feet, pressing it in vats of lye until it softened to wealth. They sang to keep the cadence even. Their song was flat and earnest and good for work. Outside a baker's, round loaves cooled in lines like shields. Each was stamped with the owner's mark, so that even bread carried identity, a small signature baked into the city's daily hunger. A boy reached, was scolded, reached again, and was given a crust for being both hungry and persistent. Across the city, household altars received their noon offerings. A pinch of incense, a coin, a cluster of grapes. The household gods, painted with quick, bright hands, stood in their niches, smiling the fixed smile of guardians. A mother lifted her child to whisper a tiny prayer, for health, for the father's safe return from Puteoli, for nothing grand, only the durable things. Beyond the walls, the vineyards ran in disciplined rows. The men tying new growth to stakes worked with quiet focus, listening to the cicadas' metallic choir. A foreman shaded his eyes and looked up the slope. There, just there, was a seam of cloud not like the others, a thread drawn straight up from the summit and smudged by wind. He watched until his breath returned to normal, named it heat, and went back to the vines. In a shaded courtyard near the House of the Faun, two brothers knelt over a mosaic in progress. Blue glass tesserae lay in bowls, green in another, gold leaf in a careful clay jar. They worked from a charcoal outline of a sea creature, its body as a curve of ordered scales. One brother placed a square, then another, turning each until it caught the light just so. Art and geometry moved together like two hands of the same body. In the next room, a tutor traced letters on a wax tablet for a girl whose bracelets chimed when she shifted her wrist. He spoke of Greek verbs. She drew a dolphin in the corner. He pretended not to see. then added a second dolphin beside it, and named them both Grammar. At the amphitheater, the caretaker walked the rows, counted benches, checked the ropes, ran a palm along the stone to feel for cracks winter might have left. In the shade of an arch, a pair of actors rehearsed, their voices pitched low, their gestures clean. The speech was comic, but they practiced it like prayer. Timing, pause, turn, glance. Each unit fitted into the next until laughter would have no choice but to arrive. A vendor stood by with a small brazier warming nuts. He watched the sky more than the actors. Not fear, just the way a man who works outdoors keeps company with weather. At the edge of town, the road to Herculaneum lifted toward the mountain. A cart paused beside a wayside shrine to Hercules. The driver touched the stone with 2 fingers and set off again. A dog barked at nothing a man could see. A pair of stonemasons, rebuilding a culvert, felt something pass through the ground like a slow animal. They straightened, considered each other's faces, and then, because the silence after was immense and ordinary, returned to their tools. The chisel's patient ring measured the afternoon. Inside the Temple of Venus, a priestess unrolled a narrow scroll, old words, worn smooth by many readings. She read them in a voice made for mornings, and a handful of women answered with soft responses. Their prayers were not dramatic. Clean births, fair weather, reconciliations that might yet be possible. When they were done, she gathered the flowers and replaited them, as skilled at binding petals as at remembering names. Outside, a philosopher drew a small crowd beneath a fig tree. He spoke of the order of things, how the heavens moved by measure, how the soul could be taught the same. A man asked whether fortune or virtue shaped a life. The philosopher tipped his hand toward the forum. Habit, he said, is the bridge between them. The listeners nodded in the shade and felt briefly wiser. The harbor held its own music, the slap of ropes, the creak of timbers, the sharp calls of sailors. A merchant from Alexandria described the lighthouse there, tall as a thought, bright as noon at midnight. He offered pepper in small linen packets, and the smell was clean and surprising, like far rain. A customs man with meticulous handwriting entered quantities with pleasure in each numeral. Elsewhere, a boy learned the knots that would make him useful, his fingers reddened by the rope, his face set, proud. A fisherman mended a tear in his net, eyes flicking up now and then to the mountain, not because it threatened, but because it dominated the kind of thinking that checks distance and weather and the hour remaining before dusk. A brief shudder crossed the water, as if a larger fish moved under the harbor mouth. He glanced at his friend. Tide, the friend said. They both accepted this with the comfort of a good, simple answer. By mid-afternoon, the heat settled. The city adjusted its breathing. Shops closed their shutters to a crack. Voices lowered. Sandals sounded softer. In the shade of an alley, a cat slept among amphorae, tail twitching in tiny verdicts against dreams. A courier trotted past with a wax tablet wrapped in cloth, news for someone, the kind that travels faster than letters. Near a fountain, an old woman told a little story about an earthquake years before, how a jug had fallen but not broken, how her husband had said it was a sign of fortune's patience. The children around her wanted a jug dropped now, for proof or spectacle. She only smiled and handed out slices of cooled pear. In a narrow workshop, a bronze caster heated a small crucible. Flame licked the metal to softness. He poured with 2 hands and a held breath, and a thin stream bright as midday found its mold. When he opened it later, a tiny laurel leaf lay cooling in his palm, light catching in each vein as if it were living. He held it to the doorway for his wife to see, and she said nothing, just touched his wrist. In that brief touch was all the empire anyone could usefully own. From a high terrace behind the theater, the view took in the whole curve of the bay. Boats moved the way thoughts do, purposeful, converging, mild. Beyond them, the sky ran clean to the horizon, and the mountain's line cut the blue like a measured stroke of ink. A slave set out figs and cheese for his master and stood aside, watching a hawk hang almost motionless over the fields. For a moment, even he forgot the order of tasks and let the stillness hold. If a god had passed through the city then, at that exact light, with that exact blend of human voices, it would have found nothing to correct. Pompeii at noon, inside its walls and beyond them, was proportion made visible. Water that arrived, grain that baked, justice that measured, laughter that did not disturb the sanctity of work. It was a small, complete answer to the question Rome asked the world: can order be beautiful? Beneath this balance, the mountain turned to thought over. No sound yet, no ash, only a pressure realigning itself in chambers no map could draw. A seam breathed, a stone reconsidered the next stone. The city felt none of this. It had lunch, and then it had a nap, and when it woke, the afternoon had the same sunlight as the morning. Toward evening's approach, the tempo resumed. Doors opened, stalls woke, sandals quickened. The rehearsal at the theater grew louder. A horn sounded from the practice ground where young men drilled with wooden swords. A pair of lovers wrote their names with a stylus in soft plaster behind a column so no one would see. Later, of course, everyone would. Memory desires witnesses even when love pretends otherwise. And still the mountain watched, with the patience of stone and the schedule of fire, its silence uncompromised, its outline perfect. The evening returned to Pompeii like a slow tide. The city loosened the tightness of the day. Doors opened, shutters drew back, and the air filled again with the soft rhythm of people being themselves. The heat still held to the stones, but shadows had lengthened, bringing comfort. In the forum, the last merchants folded their clothes. The smell of crushed herbs and oil lingered where the stalls had stood. A pair of children chased each other around the statue of Augustus until their mother called them away with the promise of bread. Her voice carried through the stillness, a single clear note that seemed to bless the evening. At a fountain nearby, water fell with the same sound it had made at dawn, steady, eternal, indifferent to time. Men and women filled their jars, passing gossip in the same tone they used for prayer. The moon, a pale crescent, began to rise behind the ridge of the mountain. In the homes of the prosperous, light grew warm and golden. Oil lamps glowed against painted walls where gods and heroes lingered in pigment, their gestures frozen in perpetual grace. On polished tables, dishes of olives, bread, and roasted fish shimmered beside cups of watered wine. Family voices wove together like a gentle chorus. Talk of the day's trade, of a cousin's wedding, of the state of the vines. A servant poured wine too generously, and laughter answered him instead of rebuke. At one table a father spoke softly to his son about the world beyond the bay, of Rome itself, which neither had yet seen. He told of the Forum there, vast as a city in its own right, and of the emperor's palace on the Palatine, where marble shone as bright as moonlight on the sea. The boy listened with shining eyes, imagining Rome as a kind of heaven that men could walk within. The father smiled and said, "Pompeii is Rome enough for us." He meant it kindly and perhaps also proudly. Outside, on the quieter streets, lamp flames swayed in the faint wind off the water. They made small halos upon the walls, and in those golden circles the graffiti of ordinary hearts could be read, declarations of affection, of rivalry, of jokes that had outlived their laughter. A poet's name, half scrubbed away, and beneath it a woman's hand had written, "Remember." Near the amphitheater, musicians tuned their instruments. A handful of citizens gathered to listen, sitting on low walls with the relaxed patience of people who know that life will always offer another melody. The music was soft, plucked strings and thin pipes, meant more for conversation than performance. Somewhere within the crowd, two young people met each other's gaze for the first time, and for a brief instant the city was nothing but that. Further down, the streets narrowed. The poorer quarter smelled of fish, smoke, and the nearness of the sea. Women laughed from balconies, a baby cried, someone sang an old Campanian lullaby that rose and fell like the tide against the harbor stones. Even here, the small altars flickered, their flames licking the darkness with the same reverence as those in grander homes. Life, rich or poor, held the same warmth in its hands. A tavern keeper poured wine into clay cups and called for a song. Sailors obliged, their voices rough but happy. They sang of distant harbors and the women who waited in none of them. The laughter was genuine, the sadness real, and the two were not enemies. Pompeii knew how to hold both in one heart. Near the edge of the city, where the road turned toward Herculaneum, a small villa looked out across the vineyards. The owner, an old man, sat beneath a cypress tree with a scroll of Virgil in his lap. He read aloud to no one in particular. His wife had long since passed, his sons traded in Rome, but the words kept him company. Forsan et haec olim meminisse juvabit. Perhaps one day it will bring joy to remember even these things. He closed the scroll, looked toward the mountain, and thought the verse meant the hardships of youth. The meaning would soon change. As twilight deepened, the baths filled once more. The water was cooler now, and voices echoed softly through the columns. Candles flickered on the marble ledges. Steam carried the scent of lavender oil and cedar. It was a kind of ritual, to wash the day away, to be new again before sleep. Outside, the sky dimmed from rose to violet, and the first stars appeared like slow embers drifting up from the city itself. At the theater, rehearsals gave way to performance. A comedy, light and quick, drew laughter from an audience scattered beneath the awnings. Coins clinked, a cup fell and rolled. The sound of applause rose and faded. The playwright bowed with mock solemnity, and someone called for a second act. The crowd answered with delight. It was the last time they would laugh together, but the gods, mercifully, did not say so. Later, the streets emptied. The lamps burned lower. Dogs settled beside doorways. The last carts returned through the gates. Somewhere, faintly, there was a tremor, a vibration more felt than heard. It rattled a bronze bowl on a shelf, and the sound died into stillness. A woman in her bed stirred, thought of wind against the shutters, and slept again. Above her, and above them all, the mountain exhaled one quiet sigh, a murmur from beneath the earth, the first heartbeat of something vast and unseen. The stars remained steady. The moonlight touched the roofs, the courtyards, the painted gods upon the walls. Peace held every stone, and Pompeii slept in perfect innocence, believing it would wake again in the morning. Morning broke again, clean, ordinary, and for a few blessed breaths, Pompeii was simply Pompeii. Bread into ovens, water into jars, sunlight finding the same old paths across the same old walls. But inside that sameness, a thread had frayed. At first, it was nothing more than the way the birds rose from the fig trees, not in a scatter of surprise, but in a long, deliberate ribbon, as if some quiet instruction had been passed from beak to beak. A boy noticed and pointed. His father squinted toward the ridge and shrugged. Weather, he said, and the day resumed its rhythm. In the forum, a marble step showed a hairline crack that hadn't been there yesterday. The scribe who had sat beside it for years ran a finger along the line, felt its thinness, and smiled at his own superstition. Cracks were the business of stone, as wrinkles were the business of faces. He sharpened his stylus and returned to totals and names. The baths breathed their mild fog. Yet in the caldarium, a single drop of water ticked from a cornice and would not stop, as though the room had acquired a clock. Men leaned back against the warmth and spoke of the price of oil, but each, without quite knowing why, kept glancing toward the doorway, as if expecting a messenger to appear and name the thing they all refused to name. Along the Via dell'Abbondanza, the baker's first loaves came darker than he liked. He frowned at the oven's mouth, adjusted the fuel, and told the apprentice to fetch finer ash for the floor. When the boy stooped to sweep, a tremor ran through the paving, small enough to pass as fancy, large enough to startle the wrist. They looked at each other, waiting for laughter to erase it. When none came, they made their own and carried on. Outside, the fountains had grown talkative. It was the same water, the same fall, the same bronze mouths. Yet a new undertone had joined the murmur, a deeper hush beneath the bright sound, like breath under speech. Women filling jars paused, cocked their heads, and then resumed, because children were tugging sleeves and the stew must be tended. Beyond the walls, the vineyards wore their discipline like armor. But the men tying vines to stakes found the ground soft where it had been firm, and firm where it had been soft, as if the earth had turned in its sleep and presented a new shoulder to the plow. A foreman knelt and pressed his palm flat, as a physician presses a chest for heartbeat. He felt only warmth and dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. A rumor took shape by the harbor. Someone had seen smoke at dawn, not the smear of cooking fires, but a lifted column, a line drawn straight up from the mountain and then unraveled by the wind. The customs man, precise in all things, said that columns belonged to architecture and metaphors, not to air. He smiled at his own wit and entered figures in his ledger. Still, when he finished the page, he looked toward the ridge longer than usual, as if to balance jest with caution. A philosopher in the forum changed his topic mid-sentence. Yesterday he had spoken of order. Today his mouth found the word measure and would not let it go. He traced circles in the dust with a stick, smaller, then larger, then smaller again, as if to prove that harmony depended as much on limit as on possibility. His students nodded dutifully, but their eyes strayed to the mountain's line, where a thin veil lay that might have been cloud, or might have been what no one wanted to say. In the Temple of Venus, a priestess lifted the bronze lid of a lamp and saw the flame gutter sideways, though the doors were shut and the air was still. She steadied it with a hand that did not tremble, then sprinkled more oil and told herself this was what lamps sometimes did. Even faith, on such mornings, preferred ordinary explanations. Near the amphitheater, the caretaker found a fine sift of ash on the upper benches, a dusting so light he could have blamed it on the mason's work, except there had been no work that week. He brushed it away with his sleeve and rubbed his fingers together, feeling the powdery memory of fire that had not burned here. He set to cleaning as if effort could unmake omen. Two stonemasons repairing a culvert paused again at the same hour as yesterday, their chisels falling silent at the exact same instant, because the ground had again received a thought from below. This time it was undeniably there. Not violent, not even alarming, but present, like a large animal shifting weight in a dark room. One of them crossed himself to a god his father had sworn was unnecessary. The other spat lightly, a sailor's charm against ill chance. They bent to work, and their hammers rang too brightly. On a painted wall along a quiet lane, a fresh line of charcoal appeared beneath yesterday's poem. If you love, love today. No one saw who wrote it. By noon, 3 hands had drawn hearts around the words, as if courage could be multiplied by repetition. At the edge of town, the road to Herculaneum lifted toward the slope. A cart horse balked and would not be persuaded. The driver clicked his tongue, then coaxed, then swore, until an old woman stepped from a yard and fed the horse a fig. It took the fruit, blinked, and walked on, and everyone laughed at themselves for being the sort of people who believed figs could cure mountains. In a courtyard near the House of the Faun, the brothers laying mosaic found their bowls of tesserae rattling minutely, each blue square ticking against its neighbor with a sound like slow rain. They stilled them with their hands and then with damp cloth. When they lifted their palms, the imprint of small squares remained, a pattern on flesh that looked briefly like a map. A poet, there is always one, stood under a portico and tried to name the color on the mountain's flank. Not gray, not white, not smoke, not cloud, a word that had to mean between. He found none and took it as a failure of vocabulary, not of safety. He decided to invent a new term later, if later arrived. By mid-afternoon, the city had split itself in two, the part that kept moving, bread, cloth, coin, water, and the part that watched. Eyes moved off into the ridge, then away, as if glances could be rationed and spent only when necessary. Dogs barked and then forgot why. A baby, woken from sleep by nothing anyone could name, chose that day to laugh for the first time, and the entire courtyard forgot the mountain for the span of that small miracle. At a household altar, a mother added one more pinch of incense than usual, then scolded herself for superstition and added one more again. At another, a young man promised a wreath to Hercules if his father returned from Puteoli by evening. He called it a bargain, not a prayer. We are ingenious in the way we hide reverence from ourselves. The fountains carried news no herald could. Their streams rose and fell with a rhythm slightly altered, as if the city had caught a different breath. An engineer, one of those quiet masters of Roman water, knelt to listen, touched the stone, and frowned at a note he could not tune. He went away to fetch tools and returned with a face that said the problem was both small and urgent, the Roman way of describing everything worth solving. In the late light, a small shower of fine ash drifted down in one quarter of the city, not everywhere, and not for long. It came as a glitter, almost pretty, laying itself lightly on arms and hair and thresholds. Children tried to catch it like snow and giggled. A woman brushed it from her shoulders with quick, neat hands, her mouth a line she did not explain. The ash melted when rubbed, smudging like coal. Someone said the fullers would thank the mountain for free powder. No one laughed loudly. Still, evening drew on, shutters opened for air. The rehearsal at the theater resumed with admirable stubbornness, lines delivered, cues taken, as if discipline could civilize the sky. In the harbor, the farther ships edged outward, sails trimming to find a breeze that wasn't there. Closer in, men told each other that deep water was always a friend and believed it, because the shore looked newly complicated. The mountain held its outline clean against the sinking sun, too perfect, like a statue that has never cracked. From its crown a thin thread rose and unspooled, and for a long time it looked like nothing so much as a veil someone had lifted for the sake of a better view. Night would answer whether it was a veil or a warning. Pompeii, faithful to its habits, laid the table, lit the lamps, and spoke to itself in the voice of custom. It has always been this way. It will be this way again tomorrow. The earth, beneath the feet of those who set it, shifted one grain more to the left. The next morning came like a lie told gently. The air was clear, almost too clear, as though the world had been washed in glass. The mountain seemed closer now, its slopes precise, its crown drawn sharp against the sky. And yet, the calm was deeper, unnaturally deep, the kind that waits for its own explanation. The people of Pompeii woke to silence between sounds. Dogs barked once and stopped. The fountains ran, but their rhythm had changed. The splash was slower, as if each drop considered the fall. Even the gulls were absent from the harbor, as though the sea had given an order only they could hear. Still, the city lived by habit. Bread must be baked, cloth must be rinsed, debts must be paid, promises renewed. If unease stirred beneath these rituals, it was met with a Roman's answer: discipline, the refusal to make imagination an enemy. By mid-morning, the first true tremor came. A cupboard door swung open of its own accord, a hanging lamp swayed, a cup rolled from a table and broke, a small sound that turned every head. Then it passed, and the silence after seemed enormous. Children laughed. It had frightened the grown. An old man claimed he had seen worse, and began a story about the earthquake years before. People smiled, grateful for the permission to treat fear as nostalgia. The ground, obedient to the mood, stayed still. At the baths, men stepped from the water to see if ripples matched their imaginations. A few crossed themselves in secret. Others made jokes about Neptune. In the women's hall, an infant began to cry, and every mother held her own child closer without thinking why. The tremor had lasted a breath, but it had whispered to something ancient in them all. The mountain at that moment ceased to be scenery. It became a presence. Toward the forum, a philosopher continued his discourse on the order of the heavens, but his students' eyes flicked elsewhere, to the edge of the city, where a thin haze hovered. It wasn't smoke exactly, but the light bent strangely within it, turning the horizon a dull brass. He paused mid-sentence, following their gaze, and for the first time in his life found that words failed him. He smiled instead, as if to say that philosophy was best tested by silence. At the same moment, a house slave carrying laundry along the upper street looked down to see the water in the gutter running uphill. She blinked, unsure of her own senses. When she looked again, it ran normal, and she decided she was tired. By noon, the air began to taste of iron. Not everyone noticed, but those who worked near the harbor felt it first. A dry tang, faint as the scent of lightning before a storm. One sailor spat and said the wind had turned wrong. Another said there was no wind at all. They watched the water darken, the tide pulling strangely at its own edges, as though something beneath were breathing. A fisherman dropped his net and swore softly, because the fish had vanished as if at a signal. On the road leading into the city, a caravan from Nola arrived coated in fine gray dust. The traders said it had begun to fall near the mountain's shoulder, thick as snow, then thinning again. The people of Pompeii listened with polite disbelief. Travelers exaggerate. Stories swell like thunder before fading to cloud. Still, the signs multiplied. Dogs whined without reason. Horses refused the bit. Wine spilled from jars that had been still for years. A thin crack ran down the wall of the Temple of Apollo, splitting the painted sun across the ceiling. The priest touched it, whispered a prayer, and promised himself to mend it tomorrow. In one of the gardens, the birds returned suddenly, not in calm flight, but in a frantic circle, as though trying to recall a path that no longer existed. Then they vanished again, leaving the air heavy and waiting. That afternoon, the first sound came from the mountain. It was not an explosion, not yet, but a groan, deep and long, a voice speaking in a language older than the city. The ground shivered once, then again, longer this time. A child on the street began to cry, and somewhere a woman dropped her basket. No one moved for a moment. The world itself seemed to be listening. Then came the second groan, clearer, closer, as if a giant hand were striking the earth from within. Dust fell from ceilings. A jar cracked in the heat. A cart tipped and rolled. People spilled into the streets, not in panic yet, but in wonder. They looked to the mountain and saw a thin black column rising where the blue had been. It was not cloudy. It did not move with the wind. It climbed straight upward, widening as it rose, and where it spread, the sky dimmed. Someone whispered, "The gods are speaking." Someone else said, "It's only smoke." But neither voice sounded convincing. By evening, ash began to fall again, not gently this time, but steadily, like rain made of dust. It coated hair, shoulders, hands, and turned the daylight to bronze. The air grew thick, and people covered their faces with cloths soaked in wine, as sailors did against storms at sea. The forum emptied first, then the theater, then the baths, shutters closed, doors barred. The city that had lived in rhythm for centuries now moved without pattern, a slow pulse of fear beneath the ash. Still, even as darkness gathered, some refused to leave their tasks. A baker stayed by his ovens, believing the heat beneath him is safer than the cold above. A priestess carried the image of Venus into the courtyard and prayed that the mountain would remember her beauty and relent. A mother packed bread and water for her children and waited for her husband to return from the docks. The air grew heavier. The birds did not return. The sea began to withdraw, its edge retreating like breath drawn inward. No one knew that this was the inhale before the fire. And above it all, Vesuvius stood like a god clearing its throat. Ancient, patient, ready at last to speak. The mountain spoke. At first, only a rumble, a rolling, subterranean growl that turned the earth to sound. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from under the feet, behind the walls, from within the lungs that tried to breathe against it. Then the sky opened. A roar rose from the mountain's crown, a column of darkness lifting into light. It rose and kept rising, a pillar of smoke and stone that spread like an unfolding tree. Its trunk was black, its branches red, and within its heart lightning flashed like veins of gold. From the summit to the sea, the sound carried a deep, continuous thunder that silenced voices, that made the air itself tremble. The people of Pompeii looked upward, their mouths open but their minds refused meaning. Ash began to fall in earnest. Not the fine gray dust of the morning, but a thicker rain, flakes of black and white, hot enough to sting the skin, cold enough to seem like snow. It came faster and faster, coating streets, roofs, faces, until the color of the city began to disappear. The sun turned copper behind the smoke. Shadows lengthened where no light remained. The air thickened with the smell of sulfur and salt, a taste of the underworld brought to earth. People moved in patterns that had no plan. Some ran toward the gates, others back to their homes, as if safety could be found in the shape of familiar walls. Parents called for children, dogs barked and vanished into the haze. The order that Rome had built here dissolved in moments, stone to dust, geometry to chaos. In the forum, statues vanished beneath the ash. The marble gods took on the color of night. The fountain still ran, its water turning black as it mixed with falling soot. A priest tried to speak above the noise, to command calm, to command faith, but the wind stole his words and scattered them like leaves. A woman fell to her knees beside the temple of Jupiter, pressing her forehead to the stone. When she rose, her face was streaked in gray. She reached for the hand of a stranger, and they fled together without a word. The sea withdrew farther still, leaving ships stranded on wet sand, their hulls tilting like wounded beasts. Sailors ran out to drag them deeper, but the water was gone, drawn away by forces they could not see. Where the horizon should have been, a wall of darkness was building, a shape that grew as they watched, until even the bravest among them turned and fled. In the city, roofs began to give. Tiles slid from eaves, timbers groaned beneath the weight of ash. Each collapse sent up a puff of gray that merged with the sky, so that no one could tell where the world ended. Still, some clung to their work. The baker kept his ovens burning, shouting that warmth would drive out the fear. A young potter covered his wheel with a cloth, as if to protect the shape of something that might yet be finished. In the baths, a few lingered, hoping the stone vaults would outlast the mountain's anger. The water steamed softly, and the sound was almost peaceful. By afternoon, the day had turned to twilight. Lightning stitched through the column above, illuminating waves of ash and stone that rained from the heavens. Small fragments struck the streets like hail. Some were light as pumice, others heavy enough to shatter where they fell. Those who had fled toward the gates found the roads already buried. The wheels of carts sank halfway. Horses stumbled, their eyes wide with terror. Each step was slower than the last, the ground softening underfoot as if the city itself were melting. Some turned toward the sea again. They said ships would carry them to safety. But the air by the shore was thicker, choking, burning the throat. The sea that had fled did not return. In the distance, the first stones fell. Not pebbles, not sand, but great black fragments, hurled from the sky like curses. They struck roofs and burst, sending showers of sparks through the darkness. A villa near the gate collapsed in silence, its garden buried, its frescoes entombed beneath a mountain that now moved. The people could no longer see the mountain itself. Only the cloud, boiling, rising, expanding outward in every direction. It reached higher than they had ever imagined sky could reach, its edges lit by the orange of fire within. Some said the gods were at war. Some said it was the end of the world. Some said nothing, because the air had already stolen the strength from their breath. Through it all, the fountains still ran, though their water had turned black. Each drop that fell made a small circle in the ash, a delicate pattern that lasted only a heartbeat before vanishing. In that rhythm, perhaps, the old order still tried to speak. Rome's promise of measure, of beauty in the midst of ruin. But the mountain had found its own geometry now, a column instead of a dome, an empire of fire instead of stone. And the city that had believed itself eternal was learning the patience of silence. By nightfall, Pompeii was a world of shadows. Ash lay knee-deep in the streets, soft as snow, deadly as stone. The air flickered with strange light. Red flashes within the cloud, each followed by a sound like tearing cloth. People clung to each other in the dark, listening for voices they could no longer recognize. Above them, unseen, the mountain drew in breath once more. The cloud bent, as if bowing, and then began to move downward, slow at first, then faster, a river of ash and fire finding its way home. Pompeii did not yet know it, but the night had become forever. There is a moment, after catastrophe begins, when time no longer measures itself by minutes, but by breath, by the spaces between heartbeats, by the weight of ash upon the shoulder. For Pompeii, that moment had come. The dawn that should have followed the night never arrived. Instead, a dim red glow pressed through the cloud, a false sunrise cast by the burning mountain. The light was thick and trembling, as if the sky had forgotten how to be sky and was learning the shape of fire instead. Those who had survived the first assault now moved through a world that had changed its rules. The streets were unrecognizable, buried under soft gray that swallowed the feet. The doors had vanished. Statues stood half buried to the waist, their faces serene above a sea of ruin. The air itself was alive, a storm of ash that hissed and whispered, each flake a spark of the earth turned to dust. It filled the lungs, settled on the tongue with the taste of blood and salt. Every breath was an effort, a small negotiation with the mountain. Yet even here, in this half-light of ending, life clung to its habits. A mother pulled her children along the buried road, telling them that the gods would see them safely to the harbor. Her voice was hoarse, but her words still carried rhythm, like a lullaby recited by instinct. In the forum, a group of men worked to clear the way to the temple of Jupiter. They believed the stone walls would hold. They tied cloths over their mouths and shoveled with wooden planks, the ash falling faster than they could move it. Their movements were mechanical, almost calm, the calm of men who have not yet admitted they are afraid. Elsewhere, a woman prayed before her household shrine. The Lares, the little gods, were covered in soot, their painted smiles fading into shadow. She washed them with wine, as though cleansing could undo what had begun. When the cup broke in her hands, she wept, not for herself, but because the ritual had failed. Toward the edge of the city, the first of the roofs began to cave. The sound was dull, almost soft, like a sighing drum. Each collapse released another cloud of dust, and those still outside stumbled forward blindly, their arms outstretched, feeling for walls that were no longer where memory placed them. The ash deepened to the knees. Those who fell could not easily rise. And still, above the roar of the mountain, one could hear small things: the bleat of a goat, the cry of a child calling a name that would not answer. A man carrying a bundle of scrolls from the library paused to rest, the weight cutting into his arms. He knelt, set them down, and looked back toward the city that had taught him to read. Then he opened one, not to save it, but to read a single line before the darkness claimed him. He smiled as the words blurred. The ash covered him gently, and the scrolls beside him turned to memory. At the harbor, the water had returned, but not the same water that had left. It came with waves that glowed from within, phosphorescent with ash and stone. Ships that had survived the night rocked violently against the piers. Men tried to board them, but the sea had become a mirror for the burning sky. The sails caught fire before they could fill with wind. A captain shouted orders no one could hear. The sound of the mountain drowned all commands. When one ship finally broke free, it rode into the red horizon and vanished into the smoke. Those on shore watched, their faces blank with exhaustion, as if they had seen a prayer sail away. By midday, it was impossible to tell where earth ended and heaven began. The cloud from Vesuvius spread outward like a vast umbrella, its stem lost in darkness, its canopy lit by constant lightning. The noise was not thunder exactly, but something deeper. The voice of stone breaking, the echo of creation reversed. Inside the city, the heat rose. Ash settled upon the skin like fine sandpaper. Every breath burned. Still, people moved, stumbling, crawling, carrying what they could: a lamp, a ring, a loaf of bread still warm from the morning. No one asked where they were going. Direction had ceased to exist. One man carried his aged father on his back, as if his body were the last temple still standing. They fell once, rose again, and kept moving, their outlines slowly disappearing into the haze. In a courtyard near the House of the Faun, a fresco still glowed faintly beneath the ash, a painted dolphin, bright blue, leaping across a crimson sea. The color refused to fade, as if the art itself resisted death. But above it the ceiling cracked. A beam split with a sound like a sigh. The dust fell in a long, graceful curtain, and the dolphin swam no more. Everywhere, the air turned hotter. Men tore strips of cloth to cover their mouths, but the heat came through anyway. Some said it was fire. Others said it was the breath of Pluto rising from the underworld. They were both right. By late afternoon, the mountain gave another roar, deeper, closer, final. The ground tilted. Walls leaned as if drunk with exhaustion. The air filled with pumice stones, falling in a steady rhythm like hailstones from a broken heaven. They struck roofs, shoulders, and skulls. The streets rang with their clatter. And yet, amidst this, one could still hear the heartbeat of Rome, in the measured words of those who comforted the young, in the calm gestures of those who shared bread, in the last small courtesies of an empire that had taught the world to endure. Night returned before the sun had properly set. The red glow grew stronger, and in its light the ash seemed to move like water. People huddled together in doorways, whispering fragments of prayer and reason. They spoke of waiting until the storm passed, of the gods calming their anger, of rebuilding in the morning. There would be no morning. But in that suspended hour, the hour between terror and understanding, Pompeii was still alive. And that, perhaps, is its greatest mercy. That before the silence, there was still the sound of love and of hope, and of people calling each other's names. It came without warning. A flash brighter than any dawn, a crack of air so deep it seemed to split the soul from the body. The mountain that had roared now broke, its crown torn open, its heart thrown into the sky. A wave of fire rolled outward, not flame as the hearth knows it, but wind and dust and stone turned to speed. It ran down the slope like a river learning it could fly. Trees folded, walls folded, men and animals caught in motion and made still again. The gods of the earth had remembered gravity. From the upper streets of Pompeii, the horizon became a single color, molten, a red-white glow moving faster than thought. The air itself caught fire. Some ran toward the gates, believing the open plain could outpace the storm. They reached the vineyards, saw the vines burst into flame, and understood there was nowhere left to run. Others hid, in cellars, beneath stairwells, in the baths, anywhere the world seemed thick enough to keep the heat away. They covered their mouths with wet cloths and pressed close to the earth, believing stillness might disguise them from the sky. In the theater, the marble seats cracked in waves, soundless beneath the roar. A statue of Apollo fell forward into the ash and shattered, its face dissolving into fragments. At the Forum, the columns stood a little longer, their symmetry defiant, before the first one bent and crumbled, and the rest followed in measured obedience. The surge reached the walls. It hit them not as a flood, but as a thought too large to bear. Stone turned soft, metal flowed, the air thickened until it became the mountain itself, moving. People vanished not by burning, but by being replaced, their space filled with ash before the body could even fall. The city's geometry broke apart, the straight streets curled, the order of Rome undone in seconds. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments of unbearable calm. A mother holding her child as if to hush it, two lovers beneath a collapsed archway, their hands still joined, a priest lifting the image of Venus toward the fire in a gesture so serene that even the mountain might have paused to watch. The ash fell faster than snow. It is covered, preserved, erased. Each breath drew in the dust of the city itself, the walls, the statues, the words written on doorways. History turned to air and entered the lungs of its own witnesses. And then even a breath was taken. The sound changed. It was no longer thunder, but something heavier, a slow grinding of stone against stone, like the earth reshaping its own bones. In that sound, the boundaries of time thinned. There was no longer day or night, only light within darkness and darkness within light. In the harbor, the ships that had fled burned at anchor. The sea glowed red beneath the ashfall, its surface rippled with drifting cinders. A few boats that had reached the far side of the bay turned and watched the mountain consume the sky. The sailors crossed themselves, and no one spoke. They could not see the city anymore, only the great boiling cloud, its base spreading like wings, its center pulsing with fire. One of them said softly, "The gods have gone home." And no one answered, for the truth it was too large to hold. Back within the walls, silence returned slowly, carried on the heat. Buildings still glowed, their outlines visible through the haze, but nothing moved. The storm had spent itself, leaving behind a world remade in gray. The air was too thick to breathe, too hot to hope. Those who still lived did so only for a few more breaths, their hearts steady, their faces calm, as though the body itself had chosen dignity at the end. And then even that was gone. The fire met the ash, and the ash met the stone. The roar faded to a murmur, the murmur to a whisper, the whisper to nothing. When at last the mountain's anger ended, Pompeii lay beneath 20 feet of silence. The fountains were sealed, the courtyards buried, the words on the walls locked away in sleep. The air cooled, and the sky turned pale again, as if nothing had happened. If a bird had flown then, it would have seen only a gray plain where a city once breathed. No movement, no smoke, no song, only the soft curve of a mountain and the ghost of a shoreline. Rome would not know for centuries what had been lost. But in the dust, the shapes of life endured. Hands reaching, bodies turned toward each other, bread still in the oven, paint still bright upon buried walls. The fire had taken the city, but the ash had kept its memory. Pompeii had not vanished. It had simply changed tense, from the present to the eternal. The fire had spoken its last word. The roar that had filled heaven and earth fell away into a sound too small to name. It was not quiet yet. The air still hissed, with settling ash. Stones still shifted in the dark. Timbers still sighed as they cooled. But compared to what had come before, it was silent. The cloud that had devoured the sky began to thin, unraveling into faint ribbons that glowed red from within. Lightning still flickered there, small and exhausted, like thoughts the mountain had not yet finished thinking. Then even those lights faded, and the world exhaled the last of its heat. No one moved. The city beneath the ash was still breathing in places, tiny, hidden pockets of life, souls sheltered in cellars, in temples, under stairs. They waited for the air to cool enough to touch, for the sound of stones to stop falling. But time had folded around them. Above their heads, the ash settled in layers, minute by minute sealing each breath away. One man, trapped beneath the half-collapsed portico of his home, felt the dust rising to his chest. He closed his eyes, thought of the vineyard behind his house and of the mountain before it, and understood that the two were the same. He whispered a line of prayer to Jupiter, and then another to the Lares, unsure which god could hear through so much earth. When the ash reached his mouth, he turned his head as if listening. Perhaps he did hear something. And then there was only the soft settling of dust. In another quarter, a woman found a hollow in the ruins of her courtyard. The air there was cooler, almost sweet. She knelt beside a broken amphora and drank the thin trickle of water that had collected within it. For a long while she listened for footsteps, voices, anything that might be human. She heard none. So she began to speak softly to herself, to keep her voice alive. She spoke of her daughter's laughter, of the morning she first learned to weave, of the way her husband's sandals had sounded on the stones when he returned from the market. She told these things to the air, and the air listened politely, as if recording. When her voice faded, the mountain kept the memory for her. Above ground, the surface of Pompeii had become a desert. The ash had settled smooth as flour, erasing every line. The temples and villas lay beneath gentle mounds. Even the city walls were only ripples now. Where streets had once echoed with carts and laughter, there was only the hush of drifting dust. A single column remained visible from the sea. The upper half of the Temple of Apollo, its capital blackened but unbroken. The sea itself was calm again, its earlier rage forgotten. The water lapped quietly against the newly made shore, its color a soft gray that mirrored the land. Far out on the horizon, sailors from Misenum watched through the haze. They saw no flames, no smoke, only the faint bulge of the mountain's shadow. They did not know whether Pompeii still existed. One of them crossed himself. Another bowed his head to Neptune. The world felt larger, emptier, as if a note in its harmony had been removed. Within the mountain's shadow, the heat began to fade. Ash cooled to crust, crust to stone. Here and there, faint shapes appeared, the outline of a roof ridge, the curve of an archway, the corner of a wall that had refused to fall. The city was being written again, but in a new alphabet, the alphabet of absence. The last sparks in the air drifted downward, glowing red, dying to black before they reached the ground. Each made a tiny mark in the ash, a constellation inverted, stars falling, stars ending, stars becoming earth. The wind rose briefly, blew across the plain, and the marks vanished. Hours passed, or days, the difference had lost its name. The ash settled into silence so deep that even the memory of sound seemed loud. If the gods spoke then, they did so in whispers no ear could bear. Above the gray sheet of earth, the mountains steamed quietly, a single plume twisting upward like a final thought. When night returned, the stars appeared in their ordinary places. They looked down upon the same bay, the same curve of shore, the same mountain sleeping once more. From above, the gods might have thought nothing had changed. Only the absence of light where the city had glowed before betrayed the truth. In that stillness, the meaning of time itself altered. The people of Pompeii were no longer living or dead. They were becoming history, caught in a moment that would not end. Their gestures froze where mercy had found them. A hand shielding a child, a cup lifted to the lips, a body curled in prayer. They had been stopped not in agony, but in motion, and the motion had become eternal. The ash that had killed them was also their shroud, their tomb, their archive. In that gray embrace, leather and wood and bread survived. Even fruit kept its shape, a memory of sweetness hardened to stone. The city had become a library written in dust, every object a sentence, every silence a paragraph. At last, the air cooled enough for birds to return. They came cautiously, circling above the plain. One descended, light as breath, and perched upon the broken edge of a wall. Its claws left the first new marks upon Pompeii in this new world. It sang once, a single tentative note, and the sound vanished into the ash. But the song had been sung, and the world, for a heartbeat, contained life again. A wind followed, soft and searching. It moved across the plain, lifting thin veils of dust. Beneath those veils, color waited, a fragment of fresco, a piece of mosaic sky, a hint of green from a leaf sealed in glassy stone. The mountain, ashamed perhaps of its fury, had kept these small mercies. Night deepened, the stars burned colder, and the sea lay still as a mirror. No voice rose from the land, but the world felt strangely full, as if the silence itself had learned to speak. And in that silence, Pompeii entered the long sleep of centuries, a sleep so complete that dreams would have time to grow roots and wait for rediscovery. Somewhere in that buried stillness, a lamp still held oil. No flame remained, but if one had struck a spark, it might have burned again. Even the mountain, exhausted, seemed to rest. Steam curled from its crown, white and harmless, as though it too sought forgiveness. When dawn finally returned, the first true dawn since the beginning, the light touched a landscape reborn. The bay gleamed, the fields beyond were gray as the moon, and the air was fresh and cool, smelling faintly of stone after rain. No sound came from beneath the ash, but the stillness was not empty. It was waiting. For what? It could not know. Perhaps for memory, perhaps for hands that would one day dig, perhaps simply for time itself to circle back. But the waiting had begun, and above it all, the mountain stood serene once more, its flanks green with vine and olive, its crown quiet, its secret buried deep and warm. It looked the same as it always had, and would look again for centuries to come. Only the gods remembered what it had done. In the distance, the sea breathed, soft and eternal. The wind crossed the bay, carrying with it the faintest scent of ash, a whisper of the city that had been. It drifted toward Rome, toward the world beyond, and disappeared into time. And the world turned, and the sun climbed, and Pompeii slept, unmoving, unchanging, the rhythm of its day forever held in silence. They learned to listen with discipline. Men mapped streets in measured lines, women sketched frescoes with the patience of prayer. They catalogued amphorae, counted loaves in sealed ovens, copied graffiti letter by letter so the voices on the walls would not be lost a second time. A superintendent, careful, methodical, taught his workers to cast emptiness. Where the ash had hardened around vanished bodies, they poured a thin mixture into hollows the shape of breath. When the plaster set and the ash was cleared, Pompeii's last night returned in human form. Not statues, but pauses. Arms raised, a cheek pressed to the crook of an elbow, fingers laced across a chest as if to keep a promise from scattering. The world shuddered, not at death, which had always been here, but at the tenderness of these gestures. It was as if the night had been interrupted, not ended, and someone had said, "Hold still, remember." With time, the new art was context. Excavators learned to leave rooms as they were found. A lamp beside a bed, a loaf near the oven, a stylus on a table scratched with half a sum, the last small arithmetic of an ordinary day. They followed footprints in ash, a child's feet beside a larger stride, a dog's pads circling a doorway, the skidding mark where someone fell and stood again. It was a grammar of panic written in powder, and yet even panic had its Roman order. Families gathered, neighbors called, hands found each other first, then bread, then water, then the gate. Every corridor of discovery curved back to the same hour, the sky turning to copper, the ash falling thicker, the world becomes sound and weight and heat. Artists came, then pilgrims of another kind. They stood in the cool, windless silence of buried rooms and felt a sensation that was not sorrow alone, but recognition, as if the city had not died before them, but had died for them, to teach how fragile a perfect day can be, and how durable its outline is. A poet whispered that the cast looked like they were asleep. A painter said the colors were truer than life because time had mixed them. An archaeologist, hands careful, eyes calm, closed a notebook after noting the position of a cup and wrote a single sentence. The last act of the day was tenderness. Elsewhere, another patience, repair. Walls were braced so the ruins could keep telling, roofs reboarded not to falsify, but to preserve what the sun would steal. Streets were cleared to their old level so that feet could find the same rhythm as carts once did. Where frescoes flaked, they were stitched back to plaster the way a surgeon mends skin. Not to erase the wound, but to honor what lies beneath it. Through it all, the mountain watched, quiet now, green again, its shadow falling over each trench at afternoon's end, as if to say, "Remember, I am part of this story. Memory requires danger to make it lucid." The scholars argued, as scholars do, about dates and phases, winds and waves, about which hour the cloud bent downward like a scythe. They read an old admiral's letter, a witness across the bay who wrote of a pine rising from the mountain, its trunk straight, its crown spreading. They matched words to layers: white ash, gray ash, lapilli, morning fall, evening surge, the breath before, the breath after. But when they stepped into the quiet houses, argument thinned to reverence. In a bedroom, a bronze mirror lay face down, as if the last hand to hold it had understood Thung. That reflection was a luxury the night could not afford. On a table, 2 dice showed the numbers 5 and 3, the throw suspended forever between chance and meaning. At a threshold, a key had dropped inches from a lock that would never turn again. These were not data, they were the timetable of a soul. Tourists arrived as they must. Feet learned the old map. Forum to basilica, via to via, house to house. Guides spoke softly in many languages. Children touched the grooves in curbstones where wheels had once passed, and their hands became clean with dust older than empires. Some came for tragedy and left with order. Some came to Rome and left with people. Each carried away a different weight. The city could not choose, it could only offer. In the hottest hours, cicadas sang over the ruins, and the sound seemed exactly right. A thin, persistent music that measured summer against silence. Olive leaves trembled. Shadows of columns lay like cool water across sun-baked stone. The last night belonged to evening, but the last lesson belonged to noon, that life is a geometry of small obediences. To bread, to work, to one another, and that within these shapes we build our eternity. New tools came, brushes of sable, cameras, grids, gentle light. Someone held a lamp above a wall and revealed a painted garden so fresh the fruit seemed wet. In the painted shade, a bird sat on a branch forever. Beside it, a gate opened onto a path that led nowhere at all. A door the painter had given the room to walk into quiet when quiet was needed. The excavators smiled. They had not only uncovered a house, but a philosophy. That beauty is the first language of consolation. They recorded the pigments, named the motifs, but in the ledger's margins someone wrote, "They loved red." It felt like a confession. It felt true. At dusk, when the visitors had gone and the guards walked the perimeter with easy steps, the ruins belonged to the air again. Swallows dipped and turned over the forum. The marble warmed all day, gave back its heat in a slow breath. From the mountain, a small wind came down, lifting dust and laying it softly elsewhere, as if rearranging the city by a fraction each night, to remind us that memory is not fixed, only faithful. A custodian paused in a doorway and listened. He would not have said it aloud, but he believed the city spoke at this hour. Not in words, in alignments, the way a shadow crosses a threshold, the exact place a star appears between broken cornices, the smell of stone after a brief rain. He closed the gate gently when he left, as if not to wake anyone. And always, beneath the management of discovery, the last night kept returning, in casts that lay as if sleeping, in bread that still remembered heat, in a dog curled beside the door it had been trained to guard. The lesson sharpened, part by part, that a city is a body made of bodies, that order is a kindness we give each other, that endings can be precise and still be merciful. We call it tragedy because the voice that tells it breaks. We call it Rome because the proportions hold even as they fail. Pompeii teaches both and adds a third we seldom name, continuity. The way a hand reaches in the dark and finds another hand, and history, watching, nods. By the time the 20th century finished its long circuit, the ruins had entered the world's household gods. They lived in books and photographs, in schoolroom posters and dreams. People who would never see the bay knew its outline. People who would never touch the stones knew their temperature by heart. The city had become a kind of shared lullaby, sorrow sung quietly enough to comfort. And still the mountain kept its green, and still the wind remade the edges, and still the guards locked the gates each night, and the stars took up their ancient stations above a city that had given the last night to time, so that time could give the last night back to us. The light had returned, not to erase the dark, but to make its shape visible. Morning light moved across the ruins like thought across the mind, slow, deliberate, illuminating piece by piece. Pompeii, long buried, now lay bare to the sun again. Each street a sentence, each stone a word returned to its language. It was as though the city itself had become a philosopher, silent, patient, certain that meaning must come in time. The world had changed around it. Empires had risen and fallen. Machines now roamed where gods once stood. Languages that would have sounded like magic to its first citizens now called to it in 100 different accents. And yet Pompeii understood them all, because time translates everything that endures. Students walked its streets with notebooks in hand, drawing the same columns, tracing the same mosaics, their footsteps mingling with ghosts that had never left. Archaeologists in linen hats paused to measure a wall, their shadows falling where Roman shadows once had. Every detail, every fresco, every tool, every mark of daily life was a whisper from the lost to the living, learn from what we left behind. There were no generals here, no conquests or campaigns, no triumphal arches or marble monuments, only bread, wine, looms, coins, the small architecture of the ordinary day. And perhaps that was why the world loved Pompeii so deeply, because its greatness was domestic, its legacy, the miracle of being human, recorded at the moment it ended. In a classroom far from the bay, a child studied a photograph of a plaster cast. He asked his teacher if the man was sleeping. The teacher said no, but she softened her voice when she said it, because there was something in that face that looked at peace. The boy nodded, and for the rest of his life would remember that death, once seen through time, was not only grief, but also continuity, a bridge between moments. Pompeii had become that bridge. Its silence was not emptiness. It was a form of thought, a long meditation written in ash. Philosophers called it memento mori, but Pompeii offered a gentler phrasing, remember to live. For in the perfect preservation of that last day lay the instruction that nothing repeats, and therefore everything matters. In the preserved shop fronts, one could still read the painted advertisements. Wine for sale, a tavern open, a carpenter's mark. These were not grand declarations, they were life in its simplest articulation, purpose, craft, presence. And that was Rome's truest genius, not conquest but order, the patient pattern that allowed even a day's chores to stand immortal. The thinkers who came later, the historians, the poets, the moralists, stood among the ruins and spoke softly of proportion. They saw that beauty and ruin were siblings, each defining the other. They realized that the ash had not destroyed form, it had preserved it, as if the universe itself believed that harmony must never fully vanish. An architect sketched the angle of a fallen column and said it was the most perfect curve he had ever seen, because time had finished what design began. A philosopher knelt beside a plaster cast and whispered that here, at last, was stoicism made visible, acceptance given shape. Even the scientists, those new priests of understanding, spoke with reverence. They sifted the ash not only for artifacts, but for lessons, for how cities grow, how people move, how culture endures. They studied carbon and plaster, but what they found was rhythm, the measured pulse of civilization still beating beneath the ruin. Pompeii, in their hands, became a dialogue between reason and reverence, each discovery an act of resurrection, each measurement an elegy, each note a prayer in a language of data. And so the city continued its second life, not as tragedy, but as a teacher. Tourists brought their awe, scholars brought their patience, and the stones, indifferent to both, simply existed. Their stillness is the purest form of truth. A curator once said that Pompeii was not a ruin at all, but a preserved idea, the idea that life is structure, and structure, when made with care, can outlast its maker. In the gentle symmetry of those streets, the world could still sense the Roman conviction that beauty was not decoration, but discipline. Even buried beneath time, the city held its posture, its streets aligned, its houses squared, its columns upright in memory if not in stone. And beneath it all, the mountains slept again. Its slopes were quiet, its vineyards full, its face serene. But even as its roots cooled, the people of the New World remembered the old warning, that creation and destruction are twins born of the same breath. Each eruption of life carries its own ash. Yet from that ash, new thoughts always arise. Pompeii had proved it. Rome had proved it. Humanity, endlessly rebuilding, continues to prove it still. When the light fades on the ruins at evening, and the wind from the bay moves through the colonnades, the sound it makes is not sorrow. It is the murmur of understanding, as if the stones themselves were whispering to all who listen. We are not what was lost. We are what was learned. When the city was found again, it did not rise from the ground like a miracle. It emerged slowly, as if memory itself were being excavated. Each stone, each doorway, each painted wall was a recovered sentence from a lost book, and those who read it became its next authors. Pompeii no longer belonged to the Romans who built it, nor to the flames that ended it. It belonged to those who tried to understand, the quiet minds bent over fragments, the ink-stained fingers that measured and recorded, the eyes that saw beauty in ruin and meaning in silence. They called themselves scholars, but they were really translators of time. Their tools were brushes and notebooks, their faith the conviction that nothing is truly gone if it can be remembered precisely. They mapped the streets like veins, each intersection a pulse, each house a thought held in stillness. One of them wrote, "The city is speaking. We must learn its language of dust." And they did. Letter by letter, layer by layer, they learned the syntax of destruction, how ash preserved shape, how heat recorded gesture, how death, when quick, could leave life intact. In their patience, they found what the poets of old had called ratio et anima, reason and soul. Science and reverence began to walk together again. Each fresco became an equation of color and intention. Each cast a study of anatomy and compassion intertwined. The archaeologist's trowel became a philosopher's quill. Where others saw tragedy, the scholars saw continuity. They spoke of civic planning, of hydraulic systems, of daily order. Pompeii's pipes still ran in straight lines beneath the ruin. Its drains still met in perfect geometry. Its bricks still obeyed the laws of harmony that had made Rome an empire of form. Even destroyed, it remained structured, as if the act of living well could not be undone by death. The artists followed, as they always do. They carried sketchbooks and pigments, trying to capture what no camera could hold, the stillness between ruin and life. They painted the plaster casts in light and called them memento vivus, reminders not of death, but of the moment before. In their work, Pompeii breathed again. Walls glowed with remembered warmth, streets filled with imagined footsteps. The ash became atmosphere, a veil between worlds rather than a grave. To paint Pompeii was to participate in the resurrection. To write of it was to study eternity in miniature. And poets, those eternal citizens of memory, heard the city's voice differently. They said it whispered of balance, of how the divine hides within the ordinary. A mother preparing bread, a boy chasing a hoop, a merchant sealing a jar against the evening air. They called it the democracy of time, that every life, no matter how small, was preserved in the same ash as emperors and gods. One poet wrote, "I walked among the sleeping, and the sleeping spoke more softly than the living." Another, "Rome taught the world to conquer, Pompeii taught it to remember." Even philosophers found themselves humbled. They saw in the casts and frescoes a living allegory of stoic acceptance. Here was fate rendered physical, not as punishment but as fulfillment, a reminder that time has its own serenity. The city that vanished in a single day had become the most patient of teachers. They spoke of cosmos, the ordered world, and realized that even in destruction, the order had remained. The eruption had not been chaos, but transformation, a violent rearranging of materials that would one day reveal beauty again. Nature, they concluded, was not cruel, it was precise. In universities and libraries far from the bay, lectures were given, essays written, maps drawn, each returning to the same truth, that Pompeii had given humanity a mirror in which it could see both its fragility and its grace. The city was no longer a ruin, but a laboratory of remembrance, a place where art, science, and philosophy met in mutual humility before time. Students memorized the date, 79 CE, but they learned the lesson behind it, that civilization's endurance lies not in its power, but in its proportions, in the careful alignment of life's small things. Order was not Rome's decoration, it was its faith. Pompeii proved that faith still lived, even when buried. And beyond the lecture halls, ordinary visitors continued to arrive. They brought curiosity, reverence, sometimes even laughter. They took photographs, their flashes briefly brightening frescoes painted by hands that had not felt sunlight for 2,000 years. The city welcomed them quietly, as if pleased that its purpose still unfolded, to be witnessed. In the evenings, when the crowd had thinned and the last echoes had died into the stones, the scholars would walk the empty streets. Their lanterns flickered against the walls, revealing glimpses of painted gardens, of vines, of birds mid-flight. The city, under that soft light, seemed awake again, as though remembering itself through their gaze. And what they learned most of all was this, that knowledge alone cannot explain beauty, that even the most precise measurement must bow before silence, that ruins, when studied long enough, become mirrors of the soul. The scholar who spends his life in dust begins to resemble the thing he studies, quiet, steadfast, layered with time and understanding. He learns that every discovery is also a confession, that we study the past not to control it, but to forgive ourselves for repeating it. So Pompeii became a scripture of ash and reason. The philosophers read it as a parable, the scientists as data, the poets as prayer. Each was right, each wrong. For the truth of Pompeii, like the truth of Rome, was never singular. It lived in the space between worlds, between fire and silence, between the day that ended and all the days that followed. And even now, as the mountain stands green above the ruins, its heart cooled but never cold, the lesson remains. That knowledge without wonder is barren. That memory without understanding is noise. That to study is to love what time tries to hide. Pompeii teaches endlessly that the mind and the heart are one discipline, the science of remembering. The Romans believed that memory was a duty. They built with stone not only to last, but to remember, to bind the future to the geometry of the past. And though empires crumble, their proportions remain. Pompeii, long hidden in the earth's heart, rose again to prove that Rome's dream had never truly ended. For the dream of Rome was not dominion, it was endurance through order, the belief that what is measured can never fully die. Every column, every arch, every street drawn true to the cardinal winds was an act of faith that beauty could survive disaster. And so it did. When scholars and poets walked Pompeii's streets, they were not only visiting a ruin, they were stepping inside Rome's mind. Here was the city's intellect made visible, the alignment of structure and soul, the perfect marriage of form and feeling. Even buried, the logic of the empire had endured, a civilization that thought in stone, that trusted proportion to remember it when language fails. The philosopher who once asked whether the world could be both rational and kind would have found his answer here, beneath the shadow of Vesuvius. Pompeii was proof that reason can be gentle, that knowledge can be merciful, that even in destruction, order remains an act of compassion. The empire had dreamed of eternity, and eternity, it seemed, had listened. Not through marble palaces or legions, but through the quiet permanence of daily life. Bread cooling on a counter, a lamp still holding oil, a fresco painted to please a stranger's eye. Each of these became Rome's true legacy, a theology of detail. It was in Pompeii's ashes that the modern world first understood the holiness of the ordinary. Here, philosophers found ethics in architecture, artists found truth in ruin, and scientists found humility in beauty. All that Rome had taught, the balance of light and shadow, the discipline of proportion, the dignity of routine, was written here in perfect accidental scripture. The poets called it the empire that dreamed. They said the gods had buried Pompeii not in rage but in preservation, to keep its lessons safe until the world was ready to understand it. And when that time came, when the ash was lifted and the colors breathed again, the dream resumed. Rome had always wanted to teach the world order, but through Pompeii, it taught something finer, understanding. That to know the world is not to master it, but to listen to its silences. That intellect without empathy is merely calculation, and that wisdom, like stone, is shaped most beautifully by pressure. In a library in Naples, a scholar turned the brittle pages of Pliny's letters, the only eyewitness who had written of that day. He read of the sky darkening, of the ships on the bay, of the falling ash that made the world night at noon. But what struck him most was not the horror, but the tone. Measured, curious, as if Pliny had seen in that chaos a pattern still worth recording. It was the Roman mind made eternal, the refusal to turn away, to keep observing even as the world unmade itself. That was the empire's truest genius, to find thought within the flame, to seek knowledge in endings, and to write even as the ink turned to dust. The same spirit moved in those who came after, in the architects who rebuilt from ruin, in the scientists who studied volcanoes and called them teachers, in the writers who saw in every disaster a question rather than a curse. They were the inheritors of Pompeii's mind, those who understood that destruction and discovery are not opposites, but consecutive verses of the same poem. The philosopher in the modern age stands beside the archaeologist in the ancient soil, each holding the same question like a lamp. What endures? And Pompeii answers quietly, only what is shaped with love. Sometimes, in the late hours, when the ruins lie empty beneath the stars, one can almost feel the old city thinking again, not in words, but in proportions, in the way the streets draw the eye toward the mountain, in the angle of light across the stones. It is a mind at rest, dreaming the same dream it dreamed before the fire, that beauty and reason, when joined in purpose, are stronger than time. The wind from the bay moves softly through the columns, a philosopher's whisper through the years. It carries no judgment, only memory. that to live with order is to live with grace, and to die in grace is to live forever. And so even now, the empire that dreamed still breathes, not in legions or laws, but in curiosity, in patience, in art. Every thinker who bends over a page, every hand that builds with care, every soul who seeks pattern in chaos, is Rome continuing its meditation. The last night of Pompeii was not closed. It was a turning of the page, the moment the human mind realized that knowledge itself could be a form of remembrance, and remembrance a form of love. The city that vanished in fire became the city that thinks for all of us, and in its stillness, the empire that dreamed dreams on. Even memory, if left too long in the sun, begins to pale. The hands that once brushed dust from frescoes have grown still. The voices that spoke of rediscovery have turned to echoes themselves. Pompeii, reborn through wonder, has entered another of time's long rhythms, the slow fading that follows revelation. It is not a tragedy. It is the ordinary work of the centuries, to soften what was once sharp, to smooth what was once sacred. Even ruins, like the people who walk among them, learn the art of aging. The stones of Pompeii no longer astonish as they once did. Visitors come in waves, their cameras clicking in mechanical prayer. Guides repeat practiced phrases. Children laugh where once pilgrims whispered. It is not irreverence, it is familiarity, the gentlest kind of forgetting. A wonder, once understood, becomes routine. The frescoes fade by degrees. Wind and breath wear them thin. Where once the red walls glowed like sunrise, the color now lies muted, a rose remembered more than seen. The plaster cracks, and the gods painted upon it lose their edges. They do not mind. They have always been patient with disappearance. Even the mountain, the old god who once spoke in fire, seems less fearsome now. Vesuvius wears vineyards and flowers. Its slopes hum with cicadas instead of thunder. People picnic on its flanks, not knowing that the soil beneath them still remembers the temperature of creation. It slumbers, a memory pretending to be peace. Scientists climb to its rim, measure gases, note changes. Their instruments are sensitive to breaths older than empires. They call it dormant, but dormancy is only a polite form of waiting. The mountain listens. It has always listened. Within the ruins, weeds thread their way between the stones. They bloom without arrogance, tiny green testaments to persistence. Nature, too, has joined the city's calm philosophy. The vines creep over broken walls, their leaves tracing outlines where once mosaics gleamed. The same sunlight that once revealed the frescoes now feeds the ivy that hides them. One art replaces another. None is wrong. Time, in its endless curiosity, is recovering what it once revealed. It is not cruelty, only balance. The earth takes back, not to destroy, but to remind us that nothing belongs entirely to our keeping. At dusk, the crowds thin and the ruins breathe again. The air cools, shadows stretch like ink poured slowly over marble. The stones seem to exhale, relieved of footsteps and voices. For a few moments each evening, Pompeii feels as it did before it was found, silent, complete, self-contained. A guard walking his rounds stops by the forum and looks toward the mountain's darkening silhouette. He knows its moods better than most. He has felt tremors beneath his boots, heard the wind move through the colonnades like a sigh. He lights his cigarette and nods once, as if in acknowledgement of something vast and unseen. Then he moves on. When rain falls, it collects in the same channels the Romans built. The drains still carry water to the old sumps, obedient to the laws of gradient and design. Even in ruin, order persists. The sound of water moving through the streets is the same sound it made 2,000 years ago, a small, steady argument against oblivion. But the plaster crumbles, the pigments wash away, and the gods at last return to anonymity. They fade as they must, gracefully, without spectacle. Their beauty is now an idea, not an image, and perhaps that is how all beauty survives longest, as thought, not sight. The scholars who once wrote passionately of discovery now write of preservation, of stabilizing walls, of sheltering frescoes from the sun, of how to balance access with reverence. Their language is careful, their tone is practical, but beneath every report lies a kind of mourning, the quiet sorrow of knowing that even the saved must one day be lost again. They speak of managing decline, as though decline were a patient thing that could be persuaded to slow its pace, and perhaps it can. But no one truly believes that time can be held off forever. Pompeii, like all who live and think, must learn the gentleness of erasure. Still, not all fading is loss. Some of it is instruction, the softening of color, the blurring of line, the crumble of edges. These are lessons in humility. The city that once embodied perfection now teaches acceptance. It whispers that the end of beauty is not ugliness, but peace. Even as walls fall, they leave behind the memory of proportion, and proportion is the shape of the eternal. What Rome began, Pompeii continues, not as marble, but as memory is refined by time's hand. At night, when the moon rises over the bay, the ruins gleam pale and dreamlike. The shadows of columns fall across empty streets like the marks of an ancient sundial still keeping time in silence. Somewhere, an owl calls, the wind answers softly, and if one stands very still, the faint scent of ash still drifts in the air, so light it could be mistaken for dust, so ancient it could be mistaken for thought. The world forgets, but the earth does not. Every grain of soil here is a syllable of that old story, the one told in fire, the one written in patience. It is fading, yes, but in the way all light fades, not to vanish but to rest. And rest, too, is a kind of endurance. The mountain never forgets. It carries memory the way stone carries weight, quietly, completely, without the need to speak. Its roots reach deeper than history. Its chambers are older than any name. When Vesuvius sleeps, it dreams of fire, and the dream warms the earth for miles around. From the city below, it looks serene, a perfect line against the morning sky, its slopes softened by olive groves, its summit veiled in mist. But the air here hums faintly, a note so low the ear cannot quite hear it, only feel it. The locals say that on still nights you can sense the mountain breathing. They say the vineyards grow sweeter for the same reason the city once burned, because the soil remembers the flame. Scientists study its pulse now, measuring tremors, recording the delicate movements of magma and gas. They speak in careful tones, of pressure, of steam, of how the mountain shifts its weight beneath the bay. The words are technical, but behind them lives the same awe that priests once felt when the gods stirred. For all our instruments and precision, we are still standing at the temple gate, listening to the same thunder through the earth. Sometimes a wisp of smoke rises from the summit, thin as a thread, and those who notice fall briefly silent. It is not fear, not anymore, but recognition, like meeting the eyes of an old teacher and understanding without words that the lesson is not yet finished. There are nights when lightning plays within the crater, silent, pale, like thought made visible. The locals watch from balconies, their glasses of wine catching the same electric flicker. Children count the flashes as their grandparents once counted the stars. The elders shake their heads and smile, half in superstition, half in memory. They call it the mountain remembering itself. And indeed, perhaps it does remember, the roar, the ash, the city asleep beneath it. Perhaps the mountain grieves in its own way, and the glow at its heart is sorrow as much as power. After all, what creature could carry so much silence without also carrying regret? But the people have learned to live with the mountain. They walk its paths, harvest its vineyards, build homes upon its fertile slopes. They speak of it kindly, as though affection might soften its moods. In the mornings, they see sunlight pour over its ridges and think it is beautiful. And perhaps that is the truest mark of human resilience, to live in the shadow of destruction and still call it home. There is faith in that, though no longer the faith of temples and gods. It is the quieter faith that life, no matter how often unmade, will always find a way to begin again. The same ashes that buried Pompeii now feed vineyards that give wine to the living. Each grape holds the chemistry of the dead, transformed into sweetness. To drink it is to take part in resurrection, to sip the proof that loss and life are the same river. The scholars know this too. They say that time is not linear, but circular, like the rim of the volcano itself. Every era stands on the remains of another. Every civilization unknowingly builds upon its ashes. To study Pompeii is to see the truth of that circle, drawn perfectly in fire. The city beneath the soil, the living city above it, and the mountain between, each bound to the others by a geometry that only eternity could design. In this pattern, the Romans would have recognized a symbol, order drawn from ruin. The Stoics would have called it reason through fate. The poets, beauty through forgiveness. And the priests, perhaps they would have knelt and called it by its oldest name, continuity. There are times when the sky over the bay turns the color of smoke. The air feels charged, and a hush spreads across the fields. The farmers stop their work. The animals lift their heads. For a moment, all seems poised, as if the earth is thinking again. Then the wind shifts, and the tension melts into sunlight. Laughter returns. The world resumes its rhythm, and the mountain keeps its counsel. But the silence that follows is never empty. It hums, like a single note held far too long. It is the same note that fills the ruins at dusk, the same that lingers in the plaster casts of Pompeii's last night. It is the sound of remembrance, the earth's low hymn to what it has seen and kept. Sometimes, in the soft heat of summer, tourists climb to the crater's edge. They stand where the sky meets the breath of the world and look down into the abyss of cooled stone. The air smells faintly of sulfur and pine. A few stones are still warm to the touch. They take photographs, but no camera can capture the feeling, that strange, humbling understanding that they are standing on the lid of time. The view from the summit shows everything at once. Naples gleaming on the horizon, the blue curve of the bay, and far below, the pale shape of Pompeii spread like a memory that refuses to fade completely. It is impossible to stand there and not think of the distance between then and now. A single heartbeat in the life of the mountain, an eternity in the life of man. At night, the mountain glows faintly under the stars, a dark geometry against a sky scattered with light. It is quiet, but within that quiet sleeps an old intelligence. Every tremor, every sigh of steam is the earth remembering itself and forgiving its own violence. The Romans once said that to understand nature was to draw nearer to the divine. Perhaps they were right. For here in this place, where creation and destruction lie side by side, the divine is not an idea but a balance, an endless conversation between what burns and what endures. And Pompeii, the city that once vanished in that conversation, still listen. Even buried, it hears the mountain dream. When the noise of the world subsides, what remains is proportion. After the roar of the mountain, after centuries of wind and discovery and dust, Pompeii has entered its truest form, the form of silence. Not emptiness, never emptiness, but a kind of perfect listening. Silence is the last architect. It levels, smooths, simplifies. It erases everything except what matters. And so, as the centuries pass, Pompeii has been sculpted again, not by fire this time, but with patience. At dawn, before the crowds arrive, the city seems almost to breathe. Mist curls through the broken streets, gathering in the old courtyards like thought returning to itself. The air smells of minerals, of sea salt, of time. The columns rise like chords of a forgotten hymn, their shadows long, their surfaces touched by moss. The birds that perch on them sing softly, and their notes fall into the same rhythm as water once fell into the fountains. A single drop still echoes, though no fountain runs. The sound moves through the quiet like memory through stone, slow, sure, repeated forever. If one listens closely, it becomes almost a heartbeat. Not of the city, but of what the city has become, a rhythm of endurance. The archaeologists call this phase stabilization. Walls are braced, colors restored, cracks measured and catalogued. But beneath the science lies something older. Each repair is an act of reverence. To reinforce a wall here is to speak softly with the dead. To lift a fallen mosaic is to return a fragment of thought to its rightful order. It is a dialogue conducted entirely in silence, a conversation between centuries. The workers rarely speak as they labor. Their trowels scrape in slow, even cadence. The dust rises, glimmers in sunlight, settles again. One of them pauses, leans on his spade, and looks toward the mountain. He has done this every day for 20 years. He says he likes the stillness, that it makes him feel watched over, not by ghosts, but by understanding. Pompeii has become a monastery without walls. Every visitor enters as a pilgrim, whether they know it or not. They come for curiosity and leave with perspective. In the hush between footsteps, they hear something intimate, the voice of their own mortality, spoken gently. The frescoes on the walls, even faded, still hold warmth. A garden scene, a fig tree heavy with fruit, a peacock beside a fountain. They were painted for joy, not for grief, and that, perhaps, is why they endure. Joy has deeper roots than tragedy. Color, once given purpose, does not easily surrender. Visitors stand before these walls in silence. They do not need to speak. The frescoes are speaking for them, reminding, forgiving, waiting. In the old amphitheater, grass grows between the stone seats. The arena is empty, but sunlight pours in as though the performance continues. Wind moves across the steps in long waves, a sound like distant applause. If one closes their eyes, they can almost hear the crowd, feel the hum of living bodies, the echo of 1,000 hearts beating in rhythm. But there is no sadness here, only continuity. What was once noise and spectacle has become contemplation. Even the air has learned to sit still. This too is Rome's gift, to turn the temporary into ritual. At midday, the tourists gather in the forum. They take photographs, smiling against the blue of the sky and the gray of the stone. Children chase each other around fallen columns. A guide's voice carries, translating the names of temples and magistrates. And above it all, the mountain stands, immense, unmoving, listening. Its slopes glimmer with vineyards, its summit still veils itself in the thinnest cloud, as if ashamed of memory. None of this disturbs Pompeii. The city accepts sound as it accepts silence, with composure. It has outlasted everything once called noise. It knows that all sound eventually returns to quiet. In the afternoon heat, the air becomes almost liquid. The stones radiate warmth stored since morning. Butterflies drift between the ruins, bright as sparks from an unseen fire. They settle on the same lintels where ivy grows, on the edges of frescoes, on the tips of amphorae. For a moment they seem like living brushstrokes, nature finishing what art began. Everything here has softened. The sharp edges of disaster have worn into curves. The place that once defined destruction now defines tranquility. The gods of chaos have become the gods of balance. Toward evening, the shadows stretch long across the stones. The city cools. The air grows fragrant with dust and vine. A flute plays somewhere, a tourist perhaps, or a wanderer, and the sound echoes through the streets as though it belonged. It is a thin, wandering melody, and when it ends, the silence that follows feels deliberate, like the closing line of a poem. The sunset pours across the mountain, turning its slopes bronze and then violet. The light settles on Pompeii's walls, and for a moment they glow from within, as if the old fire had returned in gentler form. The city seems to breathe out one long sigh of peace. Night brings the stars, the same constellations the Romans once saw. They shine over the same bay, their reflections trembling on the sea. Somewhere far off, a church bell rings across the water. The sound reaches the ruins faintly, as though time itself were praying. The moonlight pools in the courtyards, silvers the broken tiles, draws soft geometry across the paving stones. It is beautiful beyond sentiment, a beauty that has learned restraint. And in this silver calm, Pompeii finally feels complete. The silence now is not absence, it is comprehension. The city understands itself. It knows that to endure, one must first release, that to live forever, one must stop insisting on being seen. The scholars who remain late into the night sit on the low walls and write by lamplight. Their notebooks fill with quiet words, measurements, sketches, reflections. They no longer seek to prove or explain. They have learned that explanation ends where reverence begins. Their lamps flicker in the darkness like small votive offerings to understanding itself. One of them looks toward the mountain, its outline pale against the stars. He imagines it not as a threat, but as a teacher. He whispers, "You remembered what we forgot." And in the cool air, the mountain gives no reply, only a long, slow breath of mist rising toward the constellations. Dawn will come again, as it always does. The tourists will return. The guides will call out times and names, but the night's silence will remain, woven through the stones like invisible thread. It is the truest preservation. No ash, no plaster, only understanding. For in the end, Pompeii teaches not about destruction, nor even endurance, but about the grace of surrender. It shows that silence is not the opposite of life, it is its completion. And somewhere beneath that vast and patient quiet, the city still dreams, and the mountain still listens, and the world for a moment remembers how to be still. Some places do not end. They change form, moving from stone to thought, from earth to memory. Pompeii is one of them. It lies now not only beneath Italy, but beneath the human mind. Layered, enduring, a quiet architecture built within us all. When people speak of it, their voices soften, as though entering a temple. They may not know its streets by name, nor the faces of its frescoes, but something in the rhythm of its story is already familiar. For we have all lived a little of Pompeii, in the fragility of our plans, in the beauty of our ordinary days, in the silence that follows when we lose what we thought would last. The city's true preservation is not in the ash, nor in museums, nor even in the photographs carried home by travelers. It is in recognition. The world looks upon Pompeii and sees its own reflection, its own small perfection suspended in time. For every life, no matter how loud, ends in quiet. And yet in that quiet, the shape of what we were remains. Pompeii is that shape, not a ruin, but a mirror. It reflects how existence always holds both the beautiful and the brief. It reminds us that tragedy is not the enemy of meaning, but its completion. The city that died in a single day teaches that no day is small. Scholars may measure walls, tourists may trace letters in fading paint, but what they truly study is not the city, it is themselves. Each visitor carries away a little more humility, a little more patience. The city whispers to them, as it whispered to Rome, as it whispers still to the sea. Endurance is not survival, it is understanding. To stand within its streets is to feel time balanced perfectly, not rushing, not still, but turning like the earth beneath one's feet. The air feels heavier here, as though saturated with meaning. The shadows fall across the same stones that bore the last sunlight of August, and the mind, almost unwillingly, grows calm. There is a point in every visit, somewhere between the House of the Faun and the Temple of Apollo, when the noise of the modern world falls away. You hear only wind and the sound of your own footsteps on ancient ground. It is here that most people stop speaking. Some lean on a wall, others close their eyes. They do not need explanation. The city is doing the talking now. It says, "I am what you will one day be," and that is not sorrow, it is continuity. For death, seen from far enough away, looks like form, and form, seen closely enough, looks like life. In every generation, new thinkers come to Pompeii. They arrive with fresh questions, but the city answers as it always has, with silence and proportion. A philosopher writes that ruins are the mind's reflection made physical. An artist says that color is the soul's handwriting, and Pompeii has signed its name across centuries. A poet calls it the dream that survived its dreamer. They are all right, in different dialects of the same truth. For this place has ceased to belong to history. It belongs now to consciousness itself, to the universal Roman instinct that beauty is worth remembering, and that what is remembered never truly ends. At sunset, the last light gathers in the ruins. It glows on broken marble, on weeds, on the faint imprint of cart wheels in the street. That light is what the poets call mercy, the day forgiving the world for ending again. It is the same light that once fell on the baker's shop, on the theater seats, on the sleeping child. Time cannot change it. It is the same light reappearing faithfully each evening to remind us that endings can be gentle. The sea catches that light too. It turns gold for a few minutes, and the bay becomes a mirror. From the water, the mountain looks smaller, and the city, half buried, half awake, seems to float. For a moment, everything, earth, fire, memory, silence, is held in perfect equilibrium. Modern life presses on around it. Trains pass, traffic hums, drones buzz overhead. Yet the center remains still. Pompeii is not disturbed by noise. It has outlasted thunder itself. The modern world, in its rush for novelty, has accidentally created the conditions for ancient peace. Within its boundaries, time slows, and those who enter begin to breathe differently. A visitor once said, "I came to see death and found patience instead." Another wrote, "This city does not grieve, it teaches." And indeed, it teaches without effort, the way the sea teaches motion, the way the stars teach distance. At night, the museum lamps along the old roads glow like a constellation fallen to earth. Each one marks a fragment, a statue, a gate, a painting of a god who has forgotten his name. Together they form a pattern, the outline of a world that still believes in beauty. The air hums faintly with crickets. The sky hangs low in velvet blue. If there are spirits here, they are at peace. The city has become its own prayer. The mountain looms softly in the dark, a shape of patient gravity. It does not threaten, nor repent. It watches, as it always has, the way eternity watches all its children, without interference, without end. Pompeii has entered the final stage of existence, not ruin, not rediscovery, but transmission. Its story moves now through words, through images, through the quiet understanding shared between those who have stood within its streets. It has become a seed in the human imagination, and from that seed grows empathy. Empires fall, languages fade, but empathy endures. It is the most Roman of virtues, the only one the fire could not burn. And in that endurance, Pompeii remains part of Rome, the Rome that still thinks, still builds, still hopes for order in a restless world. Some nights, the bay is perfectly still. The stars reflect upon its surface so clearly that it is impossible to tell where the sky ends and the sea begins. The mountain stands between them, its shadow joining heaven and earth. And in that symmetry lies the secret of all endurance, that to last, one must belong to both. Pompeii belongs to both, to the world below and the mind above, to the fire that ended it and the thought that keeps it alive. Light survives by learning how to change. At dawn, it is a blade, at noon a field, in the evening a whisper across a stone. Pompeii has learned the same art, turning from city to lesson, from lesson to memory, from memory to a kind of light that does not fade. It begins in small ways. A traveler stands before a painted garden and feels the quiet reach of green across 2,000 years. A mason, visiting on holiday, runs his palm along a wall and nods, recognizing in the angle of brick upon brick the same logic he uses each morning. A child traces a mosaic dolphin with one finger, and for the rest of her life will associate blue with joy. These are not grand revelations, they are sparks. But sparks carried carefully become lamps, and lamps, multiplied, become the constellations by which a world can navigate. The light in Pompeii is a moral light, not the glare of conquest but the radiance of proportion. Stand in the forum when the sun is low, and the long shadows show you how a public space teaches fairness. Each column shares the light, each wall receives its measure. There are no tyrannies here, only the discipline of lines in agreement. Rome believed that justice could be made visible. Pompeii proves the proposition. In the bakeries, the ovens are mouths of dawn. Here the light is practical, flour made visible in the air, a round of bread inspected by its crust. Order becomes nourishment. Geometry becomes hunger answered. And even now, with the ovens cold and the city quiet, the shape of that labor remains, a radiance of usefulness. The visitor leaving the ruined shop walks a little more gently through the day, as though bread deserved reverence for being bread. Elsewhere, light becomes remembrance. In the small rooms where the plaster casts lie, lamps are kept soft. Faces turned away are not forced to reveal themselves. Hands lifted for air are not asked for more than they gave. The light is patient, a kindness that allows privacy within revelation. People enter and whisper, or say nothing at all. The silence is not fear, it is courtesy, the living acknowledging that the last gestures of the dead are not a spectacle but a trust. Some weep, others stand very still and feel the heart slow to the room's tempo. A few close their eyes and offer the oldest prayer, "Let me remember well." They emerge into the sun renewed, carrying a steadier light within, not brightness but clarity. Artists have always understood this. They come to the ruins to repaint what the ash preserved, but the more faithful among them learn to paint the intervals instead. The hush under an arch, the pale linger of afternoon on a step, the way a wall seems to glow from within because the pigment remembers being touched by a living hand. Canvas and camera catch a likeness, attention catches a soul. Attention is a form of light. And so the city teaches attention. It asks nothing impossible, only that the eye should look long enough for surfaces to become stories. A scratch in plaster is a decision. A groove in the curb is a century of wheels. A stain on stone is water keeping its ancient appointment. Soon the visitor begins to see their own life the same way, not as noise, but as deliberate traces left by care. The mountain, too, has a light. From the crater in certain weathers, vapor rises in a pale thread. At dusk, it becomes a column of honeyed gray, a candle set at the altar of the horizon. No one bows. Still, the air feels ceremonial. Even the vineyards along the slope seem to stand in ordered rows with a touch more dignity, the grapes dull gold or deep amethyst, each a small lantern of sweetness raised by ash. Wine made here has a taste that people call mineral, but memory is nearer the word. A glass lifted on a balcony in Naples holds the faint ember of 2 millennia. The living drink, and without knowing it, partake in a sacrament of time. The light that burned once in destruction has learned to burn now in celebration, measured and kind, kept within the bowl of the cup. Light also returns as law. Preservers and planners meet in rooms far from the bay to decide how much sun a fresco may see, how many souls may walk a corridor in an hour, how to roof a ruin without lying about its brokenness. These are not glamorous conversations. They are the quiet work of stewardship, the acknowledgement that beauty requires boundaries. Rome would have approved, rules making room for radiance. A drawing is made, a canopy here, a brace there, a path that leads the gaze toward meaning without disturbing what it illumines. In the margins, a small note retains serenity. Policies become architecture, architecture becomes mercy. The light that remains is brighter for being guided. But there is another light, the inward one, the lamp one carries home. A man returns to his city and finds its pace sharpened. He takes the long way to work to pass a fountain, remembers the sound of water in a Pompeian courtyard, and lets his shoulders fall. He cleans his desk and arranges his tools, not fastidiously, but with the pleasure of a forum set square. Order, he has learned, is not control. It is hospitality to clarity. A woman pauses at her door each evening to touch the frame and whisper thanks. She has seen thresholds buried that still remembered being crossed. She lets her rooms be true, one for labor, one for rest, a small altar of family photographs in the place where the morning sun arrives. She lights a candle some nights, not to call the gods, but to strengthen her own attention. The flame steadies the room steadies the heart steadies the day. A child builds a city of blocks on the floor, streets aligned, houses squared, a temple of 2 books and an orange. When it topples, she laughs and builds again, intuiting what Rome concluded. That proportion is a renewable joy. Pilgrimage changes people in ways they cannot immediately name. Weeks after leaving Pompeii, someone tastes ash in coffee and thinks of morning light on pink plaster. Another sees a cloud shaped like a pine and feels the slow weight of history in the ribs. Traffic at a red light becomes an amphitheater of waiting. Rows of faces turn toward a stage that is only the future. These are small transformations, but civilization is the sum of such refinements. We become a fraction more patient, a shade more dignified, an inch more tender with what will not last. And in that measure, the city has accomplished its afterlife. It has entered conduct. At times, grief tests this new light. A family loses a house to fire, a town to flood. They return to what remains, sift what the elements spared, and begin the arithmetic of endurance, counting, cleaning, choosing what can be used again. In the midst of it, someone remembers a room of Pompeii, a bench left exactly where it had been, a cup on a table, the undramatic poise of things. They take comfort in that poise. The world can break and still be orderly. This is not denial, it is the courage of form. They rebuild. And somewhere within their decisions, the measured light of an old Roman morning guides the hand. We speak of heritage as if it were a chest of objects, but what we inherit best are habits of attention. Pompeii gives the habit of seeing gently. It trains the eye to look until the mind becomes spacious. From that spaciousness, mercy is possible. The impatient are forgiven. The ordinary becomes sufficient. The day, when properly arranged, is beautiful enough. Rome's greatest victory is this: to persuade the future that elegance and kindness can be the same structure. Pompeii is the proof. It is the mother house of that calm order, teaching the craft of living well, not magnificently, but fittingly. Near evening, swallows thread the forum like needles, stitching sky to stone. Their flight is fluent geometry, a calligraphy of survival written without ink. People sit on low walls and watch, quiet smiles softening a day of dust and sun. The light descends the columns as a hand descends a harp, string by string, note by note, until the chord is resolved. The last brilliance catches on the mountain's rim, then spills away toward the sea. In that daily diminuendo lies the city's final gift, an apprenticeship in endings. The light that remains is not the light of noon. It is the light that knows how to leave. It leaves with grace. It leaves a trace. It leaves enough to follow. Night gathers. The lamps along the old streets wake one by one, small domestic stars learning their roots. A guard closes a gate with a touch like blessing. Somewhere a breeze turns a page in an unattended guidebook. Words lie back down and sleep. From the mountain comes a whisper of cooled breath. The vines murmur in their ordered rows. The bay takes the day into itself and keeps its counsel. And in houses far from Italy, windows go dark. Someone sets a cup in its place. Someone kisses a child's hair. Someone lays out tomorrow's tools in quiet gratitude. The city beneath the mind has done its work. The lamp within has learned its hour. This is the light that remains, Not spectacle, but steadiness. Not blaze, but bearing. A way to walk through a world that ends and begins in the same breath. And because it remains, Pompeii remains, not as ash, but as clarity set to a human scale, a calm empire of attentions. We are still learning how to build. Night settles over the bay like a veil drawn by patient hands. The last boats return to their harbors. Their lanterns flicker across the water like the ghosts of fallen stars. Above, the mountain looms in silence, a silhouette against the slow turning of the heavens. The air is warm and still. Even the sea seems to hold its breath. This is how all stories end, not with thunder, but with stillness. For silence, when it is complete, is not absence, it is comprehension. Pompeii understands this now. It has joined the oldest order of the world, those things that no longer move, but continue to teach. If you walk the streets after dusk, you walk between centuries. The lamps that line the old paving stones burn with a steady gold patience. Each one marks a threshold between what was and what is. The air feels thick with time, the way air feels near the sea just before dawn, full of waiting. Your footsteps make a sound so soft that even the mountain listens. In the windows of buried houses, the moonlight pools. It lies on frescoes, on stone benches, on the bronze hinges of doors that have not moved in 2,000 years. Everything glows faintly, as though some inner lamp still burns beneath the ash. The city is dreaming again, but its dream has changed. Once it dreamed of markets, of laughter, of the fragrance of wine and bread. Now it dreams of meaning, of being remembered rightly, not for its death, but for its proportion. Across the bay, Naples hums and shines, 1,000 electric constellations glittering along the water's edge. The people there live quickly, cars, music, the pulse of modernity. And yet, beneath their feet, the old earth keeps its rhythm. Every heartbeat of the mountain, every sigh of its hidden fires reminds them that the present is only another surface, drawn carefully over deep memory. The ancients would have called this wisdom gravitas, not heaviness, but depth, a weight that anchors the spirit so it cannot be blown too far by fortune or fear. Pompeii gives that weight to all who touch it. It is not a burden. It is the balance of having seen eternity and choosing still to live within a single day. The Romans believed that peace was not the absence of struggle, but the mastery of it. They called it pax, order restored, harmony rediscovered. Pompeii is their final pax. It is Rome's last poem, a city that died in perfect symmetry and was reborn in universal calm. Every empire seeks immortality. Rome found it not in conquest, but in continuity, in the way its virtues migrated from marble to memory, from the Tiber to every place touched by its thought. Pompeii became the proof. It showed that even when the marble falls, the geometry remains. And through that geometry, Rome still breathes. In every architect who seeks balance, in every philosopher who speaks of reason, in every artist who finds grace in ruin, in every soul who looks at the world and chooses order instead of despair. The mountain watches. It has grown gentle with its remembering. It no longer burns, it exhales. Each night, a faint mist drifts from its crown, a whisper into the cold air. It is not threat, but prayer. Perhaps it prays for the city beneath it. Perhaps it prays for us. The people who live in its shadow speak of the mountain with respect, never with fear. They know what sleeps beneath their fields, but they plant anyway. They laugh, build, love, as all people must. They have learned from Pompeii that life is not the opposite of disaster, but its continuation. That to endure is not merely to survive, but to understand. In museums far from Italy, children stand before vitrines of amphorae, of small glass cups, of jewelry the color of dawn. They press their palms to the glass as if to feel the temperature of another time. Their teachers speak softly, but the children are already somewhere else, walking the streets of a city they have never seen, hearing the soft echo of sandals, the distant bark of a dog, the hiss of something vast and bright drawing near. They imagine the moment and then the silence after, and they do not look away. In that quiet courage, Pompeii lives again. For every generation must see its reflection there, its pride, its frailty, its beauty, its assumption that tomorrow will come. To face that truth without trembling is the beginning of wisdom. The historians say that Rome's true gift was not empire, nor law, nor architecture, but continuity. To build upon what was built, to learn, to refine, to remember. That is how civilization survives the fire. That is how a ruin becomes a teacher. Pompeii carries that flame forward, quietly, perfectly, like a candle cupped in both hands. The ash has cooled, the centuries have turned, the sea still breathes. And yet, somewhere deep within the earth, the shapes of that day remain. Tables, tools, fruit, faces. The moment of ending preserved not to frighten, but to instruct, to whisper, all this will pass, and all this will return. Near midnight, the wind moves down from the mountain. It passes through the ruins, lifting the smallest grains of dust. They swirl for an instant in the starlight, and then settle again. It looks almost like the city, breathing in its sleep. A guard closes the final gate. His lantern swings, casting gold arcs on the stones. He pauses to listen, not for danger, but for confirmation, that the world, for all its noise and fever, still holds one place where silence is enough. He hears the sea. He hears the wind in the vines. He hears perhaps the faintest murmur beneath the ground, a conversation between ash and memory, continuing still. He nods once and walks on. And when the morning comes and the sun returns over the bay, the light will fall again on Pompeii, gentle, gold, unchanged. It will touch the mountain's crown, then the roofs, then the courtyards, and the day will begin exactly as it did on that last morning long ago. Birds will sing, the air will be warm, the city will not move, but the world will. And that is enough. For in this endless rhythm, destruction, silence, renewal, the universe keeps its promise. Nothing truly vanishes, everything transforms. Pompeii has fulfilled that promise. It died as Rome and rose as remembrance. And as long as we remember it gently, it will never die again. And so ends the night of Pompeii. Not in tragedy, but in understanding. Not in fear, but in calm. It is the story of all things that perish beautifully, that what was built with care remains through care, and what was loved once will be loved forever. The fire sleeps, the sea breathes, the mountain waits, the city dreams, and beneath all of it, deep in the earth, deeper still in the mind, Rome continues. Before we drift away from the ruins, before the mountain fades to shadow, and the last lamps along the old streets fall quiet, take a breath with me. The story of Pompeii is not one of fire alone. It is a story of patience, of beauty enduring through silence, of the calm that follows even the greatest storms. Every life, every city, every dream we build with care, they all pass through some kind of fire. But as Pompeii shows us, what's made with love doesn't vanish. It changes form. It becomes light. It becomes a memory. And tonight, that memory rests with us. As you listen, somewhere across the sea, the real Pompeii still lies beneath the stars. The mountain sleeps. The stones breathe quietly in the dark, and the same constellations the Romans once knew are shining above them still. If you ever stand there one day, you might hear what I've tried to describe tonight. The hush of the streets, the faint hum of the wind against the walls, the sense that the whole world has paused, just long enough for you to understand it. And in that stillness, you'll know what Rome truly meant. That beauty, when made with proportion, outlives the hands that shaped it. Before you go, whether you're here to rest, to think, or simply to fall asleep to the sound of history breathing, I'm really glad you're here. Tell me in the comments, if you could walk one Roman street, which would you choose? The markets of the Forum, the gardens of a villa by the sea, or this place, Pompeii, frozen forever between life and time? If you find peace in calm history like this, a like or a subscribe helps this series reach more gentle minds who love Rome's story as much as you do. Quietly, almost everyone who listens, about 99%, isn't subscribed yet. If that's you, maybe take a moment to join us. It helps more than you'd imagine. Now, let the music fade. Let your shoulders soften. Breathe in, slow and deep. The mountain is silent again. The city sleeps beneath its soft gray blanket. The air is warm with the memory of light. And as the night carries us forward, remember this: Pompeii did not end. It became a way of seeing, a reminder that what we love and what we understand are never truly lost. Sleep well, traveler, and may your dreams tonight be calm and full of light.